Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization dedicated to peace, economic and social justice, good government, and a clean environment. Every month, we invite an expert to enlighten us on a topic related to our mission. Because Village TV videotapes these presentations, we can share that expertise with a larger audience. We hope you enjoy today's broadcast.
And now we'll move on to today's program. And it's a discussion of the book, as you know, the two-parent principle, how Americans stopped getting married and started falling behind, written by Melissa Kearney is her name. She's an economics professor at the University of Maryland. And some of you may have heard of this book. It's certainly an interesting topic, and it's I don't know if you'd call it controversy. I guess you could call it controversy. It's engendered some controversy because of the way she states the problem and some of her policy solutions. I think, I haven't read the book, I'm not sure, so Sue will tell us, but I think she kind of comes down maybe on both sides of some issues, but rubs some people the wrong way. So it should be interesting. It should be very interesting, and we certainly have a person who is beyond qualified to speak about that today, and that is Suzanne Modell, who you know as president of Concerned Citizens, but she is also she's a professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She is a research fellow at I forget what it's called here. Oh yeah, the Center for Population Inequality and Policy at UCI. Got her Master's of Social Work degree at Simmons College in Boston, go Sox, and she got a PhD in social work and social science in the University of Mississippi, no, the University of Michigan. Go blue, go big blue. I actually hate the Red Sox. I'm rooting for the Yankees, but I lived in Boston for 40 years. Anyway, so there is nobody better qualified to speak to this topic today. So I'll get out of here right now and give you Sue Modell.
So actually, I'm going to be to some extent doing a book review. Thank you for coming to a book review. Book reviews used to be a staple of Concerned Citizens. When I joined about 10 years ago, we have 2 or 3 of them every year. And I just really liked them because it was an opportunity it's not the author who actually is present, but it's somebody who has something to say about, it's always an important nonfiction, current event kind of book. And I would very much like to bring back this practice of doing book reviews, and the main reason we aren't having them is because people are not volunteering to do them. So if you get inspired and read something, think about something you might want to share with us. Wendy, would you raise your hand? Wendy Burry is our program chair, and she will take any and all applications, and we will express load you in to give a talk about a book. Now this is a topic we're going to be talking about living arrangements, mostly with children and midlife prime age adults. And this is a topic that I have been thinking about because of some work that I do. I am a research associate, and I do some research, and I have become more or less aware of some really large changes that have been going on really over my lifetime. But to the extent that you live in your own little bubble, sometimes you just don't have a sense of what the major trends are. So I'm grateful that this book came out. This book is kind of a vehicle. It's an excuse for me to find a way to talk about what I think is a really intriguing and interesting change, and something that deserves more of our attention than it's been getting. So, as Alan mentioned, Melissa Kearney is an economist. She has a PhD from MIT, which is somewhat daunting. She claims to be a moderate, People on the far left are quite unhappy about her book. People on the right are quite pleased by it. And actually, if you read the book, I think the very fact that that's the reaction you're getting is interesting. To some degree, in my view, it shows that even those of us on the left, if the facts don't quite meet where we'd like them to be, then we too might, maybe we're not as bad as people on the right, but maybe we too are just going to try to find explanations and excuses and so forth. So I'm going to say that I think that Melissa Carney's book has quite a reason to take on things. I would just tell you very briefly, in terms of her credentials, that she has done all kinds of research on families, which women scholars often do, and she has found, interestingly, that watching Sesame Street is associated with helping deprived children to learn faster, to learn reading faster. So, that strikes me as an interesting finding. Another kind of, she does this interesting applied research. Another thing that she did was she did some research about a program that is called, let me see if I can get this on here, because I'd never heard of it. 16 and Pregnant? You've heard of it. Well, maybe I'm kind of out to lunch. And this is a program that kind of talks about the disadvantages of teen pregnancy, and it has different episodes of kind of sad stories about different people. And she was able to show that young women who watched that were less likely to get pregnant. It did have a small effect. So I think that kind of research is really interesting, and that we should take it seriously. And I tend to take seriously what she has to say in this book. All right, so let's get started. A good speaker generally starts by telling you what they're going to say, and I'm going to do that. The first part of my talk, I'm going to describe living arrangements. In particular, as I said, I'm going to be talking about children's living arrangements and prime age adults' living arrangements. I'm not going to be talking too much about us. Originally, I had stuff in there about us, but it was too long. So I had to cut it. If you have questions about us, you can save them for the end. So we've got, this is a kind of a exaggerated difference. We've got two kinds of housing relations, the overcrowded house and the undercrowded house. So what difference does it make if you live in an overcrowded house or an undercrowded house? That's going to be the second part. I'm going to talk a little bit about, okay, once I've told you how people are living, what are the implications of that? What are the upsides and the downsides? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why. So why have we had these changes that to some degree have untoward consequences? What do we think are the reasons? Now, I was going to have, this talk was much longer, I was going to have a section on, well, what should we do about it, right? That would be the last part. But my talk was so long that I've cut that out, and actually I would like us to spend the questions and comments time. You know as much about what we can do about it as I do, and maybe what we'll do is, instead of just requiring questions, if you have a comment at the end, provided it's not too long, we'd be happy to take a comment rather than just a question, because there's a lot I'm not talking about with respect to how we might move forward with this. So let's begin with the living arrangements of children. And here's a graph, and there are going to be, I'm going to you a few graphs in this presentation. And most of the graphs that I'm going to do are going to have time on the bottom. And so what this graph shows you is the change. I like 1960 as a really good benchmark for me to look at the change between 1960 and now. And so in 1960, we can see that almost 80% of children lived with two parents. That was around the time that we were maybe leaving the nest. And so now it's about 70% of children are living with two parents. Approximately 20% are living with their mother only. And if you look at the graph, you can see that actually this is not a new event, is it? Actually, since about the mid-90s, the proportion of children living with only their mother. It has been about the same. And these other numbers maybe moved up slightly a little bit later, but it's about 5% of children live with their father only. 5% don't live with their parents. They might live with other relatives or be in institutions. So what we can say is that these changes basically have already been in place for a while. And so when this book comes out, actually it's not news, right? If you want to think about it, the situation, some of these things have been going on for quite a while. All right, now these are the children's living arrangements. Now I want to tell you a little bit about adults' living arrangements. And the major change in adults' living arrangements is, as many of you probably know, that we're not getting married like we used to. Or if you don't know that, that will be an important new thing for you to understand. So again, back in 1960, when we were leaving the nest, or even 1970, about 72, let's say 70% of American adults were married. Now about half are. And that is a pretty large change, right? And the greatest change, if you look carefully, is actually in the percent that are not getting married at all. So back here, 15% were never married, and this is only 2010. These are the best things I could find. I'll actually show you something shortly that's a little newer. But so 28% of the population had never been married in 2010. That's like something unusual in our history. Now there's a group that's missing here, or if you're sharp, there's a thought you might have about this graph, which is it omits cohabitors. Remember, cohabitation is up. So I couldn't get them both on the same graph. This starts much later, so I didn't want to show it right away. But here again, what you see is a drop in the proportion married. This is just over the last 30 years. And an increase in people who are unpartnered, and 9% are cohabiting. Actually, I looked into the figures, it's 10% right now. So at this point in time, about 10% of the adult population is cohabiting. We do hear a lot about it, but actually it's only, now again, this is at any given point in time. This is not over people's lifetimes. Right? So many people may have cohabited at one point or another, and if you ask people whether you'd ever cohabited, you'd get much bigger numbers. But at a given moment in time, only about 10% are in a cohabiting relationship. And one of the points that Melissa Kearney stresses in her book is how much more fragile cohabitation is than marriage. And I don't know how well recognized that fact is, that the average cohabiting relationship in the United States lasts for 18 months. So it's not for very long. And this, but that's the average. Now again, I see someone shaking their head. I'm going to be talking about average people, or generalizations, or what happens for the most part. I'm not saying that nobody stays cohabiting for life. I know people who have done that. Okay, these are just general trends. So the general trend is that cohabitation does not last for very long, and you can see that here. This is a graph of the difference between married and cohabiting parents over the lifetime of a child. So down here we have a child from the time of birth, when we're assuming the parents are together. This is a longitudinal study, so somebody followed the same children until, somebody at Brookings actually, until they were 15 years old. And what they found is by the time the child was 15, about 22% of those who had cohabiting parents still had the family together. Whereas, let's see, what is this is here? It's about 65% of those who were married. So obviously marriages fail too. Marriages are not enduring forever, but they are more resilient and they're likely to last longer in the cohabitation. And then this has an effect what Carney is trying to argue is you cannot assume that cohabiting is a substitute for marriage, a substitute for having a father in the home. Okay, so my main points are that more children are spending more time with only one parent than when we were young, and more adults are spending more of their time unpartnered. Now, why should we care? What difference does it make? Well, let's look a little bit at the consequences. What are the consequences of residing in a single-parent household? Well, the number one consequence, you know what it is. It's poverty, right? You don't have to be a rocket scientist to imagine that a single parent, whether it's divorced or never married, is going to have a tough time making ends meet. And to me, some of this I didn't know when I started looking. I thought this was really quite striking here, that these are 2022 figures. So 11.5% of single father families, and that's only 5% of them, right, are below the poverty line, and 31.7% of the single mother families, and those are the great majority, are below the poverty line. So there's quite a difference, and much, but not all of the problems that are associated with being raised in a single parent household are associated with poverty. I'm sure you actually knew that. You didn't come here to help me tell you that. But I do think it needs to be emphasized. Okay, other consequences. Okay, generally research shows that children who are raised in single-parent households have more trouble in school than children who are not. And nowadays, trouble in school is much, much more serious than it was years ago, because if you don't go ahead in school, you're not going to be able to make a decent living. So all these problems are just more likely, and there are also social problems as well. Children who are raised with a single parent are more likely to get into trouble with the law. They're more likely to become single parents themselves. Now, again, this is not everybody. We know, in fact, there's also another phenomenon where people whose parents were divorced found that was just so traumatic that they vowed, that they would stay in a marriage no matter how rocky it was. So there is that effect as well. But for the most part, you do find that someone who has been raised by a single mom has a higher probability than someone who wasn't of duplicating that kind of behavior. And Carney explains it primarily by saying that parenting takes more than money. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes patience, and it's really, really hard to have a full-time job and manage to do all this, to do everything on your own. Now, there is another side to this, however, that I would say, yes, Carney she's absolutely right in saying all of that. But at the same time, sometimes being a single mom is the right decision. Sometimes, in some ways, we might say that even when other things are the same, that the woman who decides not to marry her partner or the father of her child knows what she's doing. So here's a criticism that I will let you read. I don't read my slides if I can help it, but I think this is a compelling and accurate criticism. Now, I think this is exaggerated. I think the home life of the average child of a single mom will be more like the home life of a child whose parents are perhaps not getting on, but I don't know that necessarily means that that there's going to be violence. But part of what this criticism is pointing out, and we need to keep that in mind, is that people who become single moms might in some ways be different from people who don't. and that the circumstances and the relationships associated with single motherhood and divorce are going to be different from the circumstances associated with being married and staying married. Actually, there's a second issue there, which is staying married. So I don't disagree with the criticism. Both these things are true. That is to say, the child might be better off without the partner, but without the father, but in the household. But then again, there might be a price to pay for that. All right, let's talk about some other consequences. Let's talk about the consequences for the adults that are not living with a partner, that have either been married and now aren't, or never married. And again, what I would want to emphasize, unfortunately, is that there are economic advantages to marrying. Some of these are very obvious, like one breadwinner earns more than two, you knew that. But did you know that married men earn more than single men? And that's not just because they work more hours. Married men actually earn more than single men, even if they work in the same jobs. In other words, all of the things being the same. We're not 100% sure why that is. It may be that they work harder because they have dependents who are in need of their salary. It may be that their bosses think they deserve more. Because the interesting thing is that married women do get paid more. Actually, married women and single women and single men all earn actually around the same, and married men earn the most. But in any event, if you want to make a lot of money, you want to make more money, you should get married. So you can see how some of this, maybe that does get a little bit silly. Or for women, actually, if you've heard about the motherhood penalty, so actually the way that women lose money is to have kids. And being a single mom is perhaps a paradigmatic example of that. So if money is all that's on your mind, if you're a male, you should marry. And if you're a woman, you may or may not marry. That's fine. But you should not have children under any circumstances. Okay. Other consequences of living alone. Okay. There is research that shows that people who live alone are more likely to get involved with drugs, with other kinds of abuse and self-destructive behaviors. And the reason is fairly simple to understand. First of all, if you've got another person under the roof, that person is going to be watching you. And like maybe you should go to the doctor, right? But you don't go to the doctor because there's nobody there telling you, you're really not taking care of yourself, you should go to the doctor. That might be one example. Or even the other way around, maybe you really would like to have a few drinks, but you can't hide the bottle because you've got somebody else living with you. This is pretty obvious to me that there would be ways that those of us who tend to be self-destructive could not take as good care of ourselves if we're living alone than if we're living with a partner. And research supports that. So there's poorer physical health and higher mortality. Actually, if you just look at the statistics, at any age, if you are married, your death rate is lower than if you are single, never married, divorced, separated, or whatever. Now, does marriage protect you from death? No. I don't know that I would go quite that far. You might also think about it, since it's very complicated, that, maybe the people that marry and stay married are just more of those kind of people that kind of do what they're supposed to do as compared to people who don't marry and who are more independent and don't feel that they want anyone to tell them what to do. I don't think that we really know the mechanisms, but I'm trying to help you to see that it is complicated. We do know that married people are healthier, and guess what? Married people claim to be happier. So these are the results of a GSS survey that was done about 3 years ago and was reported in the Post. And you can see that married adults are happiest, followed by cohabiting adults. And unpartnered people, the neithers, those are the unpartnered people, they're only about half as likely to say that they are very happy than people that have a partner. So does marriage make people happy? Now, you should be, I think Gloria's looking a little bit like, that may be going too far. And I think it may be going too far. So here's a long quote I want you to read. So married people may be happier. I think it's because people who marry tend to be happier in the first place and perhaps a little better adjusted socially, and they're going to do what they're supposed to do than people who don't. People who don't, or people whose marriages don't last, are simply, they're more individualistic, and they're perhaps more mixed up, driven, confused, whatever. Less likely to just be happy. Now, have any of you ever heard of Bella DiPolo? I had never heard of her, but I'm kind of embarrassed that I hadn't, because when I started doing a little research for this paper, for this talk, is when I discovered her. She's a 70-year-old, never married psychologist with a Harvard PhD who has devoted her career to promoting the single life. And she's written books. I'm thinking of getting one for my daughter. I'm very serious. My daughter's not married. She might get a kick out of, this woman just thinks that not being married is the coolest thing and the best decision anyone could ever make. And I'm willing to, Melissa Kearney would not agree. I'm sure that she would not agree, the author of the book. But let me give you some of the reasons why people who are unpartnered might be happy. First of all, they have more free time. In fact, if you become widowed, you experience the fact that you have more free time, and that means you can volunteer more. You can, in fact, work harder, which there's an interesting book that's come out recently by an economist named Claudia Gold, and she talks about women and careers, and she talks about the problem that professional women have is something called greedy work. And what greedy work is, if you're a top lawyer or an accountant or in a business, that any leisure that you have nowadays, your work will be happy to gobble up. And if you've got a husband or children to worry about, you simply are not available 24/7 and don't take vacations, which seems to be the increasing norm in America. So basically, if you want to have a life, you are going to not be as successful as this single person who perhaps can devote her whole time to her job. And the other thing that's interesting, I have heard research that confirms this, that people who do not who live alone spend more time taking care of other relatives. Well, that makes sense too, right? I mean, if you've got a relative living with you, that's taking up a lot of your time. You generally have more time to go take care of your brother or your parents or whoever else is needy. But if you're living by yourself, you can donate more of your time to others. All right, now here's a kind of a gruesome. It's my final advantage for living alone. And that is that you have less chance of experiencing domestic violence. That is obvious, right? The fact of the matter is, if you don't have sex, your chances of catching a sexually transmitted disease are small. And if you don't have a partner, the probability that your partner is going to beat you up is extremely small. So if there's one way that you can avoid domestic violence, it is not to get married. Now that might sound very, very silly, but I want to show you this graph because this caught my fancy, that basically, this is one of these graphs that has time on the bottom, and what it shows is the rate of domestic violence for intimate partners. And the rate was 10 per 1,000 persons in '94, and it was down to about 3.5 by 2012, obviously. I don't know, I don't have further data. I just found this on the internet. So I don't know what the trend is since. But I think it's interesting because what it shows is that to some degree, as people were partnering less, there was some decline in the amount of partner violence. A little bit less here. Now, this is intimate family. It's a bit more complicated. That would include child abuse as well. You see a little bit of a drop there, but not quite as stark. Anyway, I think this is an interesting finding. I was hoping that Vivian Klesak would be here. She's an absolute expert. Some of you may know that on domestic abuse. But she wasn't able to come, so we'll have to ask her another time. But just trust me when I say that you're well protected against domestic abuse if you don't go into a partnership. All right, so now you've seen, I've described to you changes in our living arrangements, and I've talked a bit about the pros and cons of these changes. So now, why is this? Why have we had these changes? And what factors are associated with the rise in single parenthood and living alone? Now, if you know social science at all, you know that there are always 3 characteristics that always are related to everything. And so we first have to look at those 3 things. What are they?
Your personality.
Race, sex, and class. Okay? Basically, most social phenomena, certainly they vary by personality, but I'm a sociologist, not a psychologist. And again, even with personalities, you have to develop some kinds of typologies. I'm sure personality matters here. But race, sex, and class matter too. And those are the 3 things that social scientists, economists, political scientists, sociologists tend to look at first. And it turns out that obviously your living arrangements are correlated with race, sex, and class. However, I have to warn you that in terms of social class, I'm going to be using a sort of unusual indicator. I'm going to be using education as proxy for social class. Why? Because I've just explained to you that whether your living arrangements, whether or not you're partnered or not, has a great deal to do with your social class. That is to say, if you're married and you have 2 incomes, you're much more likely not to be in a lower class. So what you really want to do, if you're going to look at the effects of social class on living arrangements, you kind of want to know what social class people are in before they go ahead and marry or not, right? Because that's the way causality works. And most people, though not all, have completed their education before they enter into an adult relationship. So that's one of the main reasons I'm going to use education. So let's just take a look. I've got a couple of interesting graphs, with respect to education. Now here again, we have time on the bottom. There we go. And I like to start with 1960. You've kind of seen that before. Now this curve on the bottom is the percent of adults married by education. And this is the less than high school. These are the least educated people, this bottom line. So in 1960, about 65% of them were married. And when you get here, it's only 27%. So there's really been a very large drop in the proportion of adults who have less than a high school degree. We might want to call these kind of lower class people, right? Lower class, less educated people have really stopped getting married at a startling rate. Now, if we look at people with a college degree or more, that's the gray line, we can see that in 1960, it was maybe about 65% were married. And if we go across here, well, there's been a decline, but it's really kind of small. There's still 59% of them married in 2018. I don't know what happens going forward from there. But this is a pretty stable result. So what that really means is that most of the decline in marriage has occurred among less than high school and non-college graduates. It is not to say that all the marriages in the college-educated group last forever, but what it does suggest that if their marriage fails, they're much more likely to remarry, and that if you have less education and your marriage fails, you're less likely to remarry. Now, what about single motherhood and education? Okay, here's a graph of the proportion of mothers who are single by education. Years again at the bottom, but now with proportion of mothers, you want a low curve. You don't want a high curve. The higher number here means that you're having a higher rate of single motherhood. So here we can see that in 1960, maybe 4%. You think about this as 10%, 20%. So maybe 4% of women with a high education were single moms during when we were young, and now in 2010, and this number is continuing to rise. Basically, we have 10%, but it's not nearly as many as here. So here we see that for women who probably have a less than high school education, about half of them are single moms. For those who, let's say, have high school or some college, about 40% of them are single moms. That's huge. Now this is only moms, okay? This population is moms, so it's not counting people who are not moms. But among people who are moms, right? If you're college educated, you have, then 10% are raising a child on their own. And if you have less than a high school diploma, half of you are. That's a large difference. So what I'm trying to illustrate is that there's a kind of a fissure going on in our society that we don't know a lot about, that we're not paying much attention to. And it may be another reason why we're becoming so polarized, that our lives are diverging. Okay, that was class. Now we're going to do race, sex, and class, right? So what about race? Okay, well, as you might imagine, there are also substantial racial differences in terms of marriage rates. So blacks are least likely to marry. About 30% were married in 2020. This is a 2020 slide. As compared to Asians, who are most likely to be married at a point in time, 58%. Now, some of that has to do with economics, right? Some of that has to do with poverty and the fact that if you have less resources, your marriage is certainly going to have greater difficulty surviving. But it isn't all that, because we can to some degree kind of control for that. That is to say, let's just look at college grads. So imagine that I were to give you these statistics, but restrict it to college grads. So now if people have better jobs. Well, about 81% of college graduates who are Asian, 81% of them are married, whereas 66% of blacks are married. Now, that's a large difference. Okay, on average, only 30% of blacks are married, but if they're college graduates, 66% of them are. Nevertheless, among Asians, 81% are. Well, if you know much about Asia, maybe it doesn't surprise you very much. First of all, Asians are predominantly first and second generation. They haven't adapted to American norms yet. I'm totally serious about this. There are a lot of things that, bad health, there are a lot of things you assimilate into after a few generations in the United States. People who lived here longer are much more likely to have marital breakup, and they're much more likely to have all kinds of chronic health problems. But the fact of the matter is that even within the same social class culture, these backgrounds do matter. They are a part of the story. They are most definitely not the whole story, but race, sex, and class matter. So now what about gender? Are men more likely to live alone?
No.
No, yes. Well, actually, it's a trick question. If you don't distinguish among age, by age, you don't see what you should be seeing, all right? Basically, men are more likely to live alone until they get old like us. Actually, we're not going to talk very much about us, but if you're going to talk about the phenomenon of living alone, then you really have to bring age in it when you're talking about gender, because men's experience, they're always more likely to live alone than women, except when they're old, and then we beat them. And that's, of course, because we outlive them. Right? But the fact of the matter is that what I would like to suggest to you is that we need to worry about these men, and we need to worry about these men. I don't think we need to worry about these too much. I think that we're taking care of them. But the men who are living alone in their main adult lives are likely much more likely to run into problems than women are. You know, men are like twice as likely to be homeless. If you look at the homeless population, it's overwhelmingly male. If you look at the incarcerated population, it's overwhelmingly male. Now, if a man is married, he is less likely to go to jail. He is less likely to become homeless. Drug overdoses. I've read some stuff about opioid overdose. Males who are single, unpartnered, much more likely to overdose than women who are single. It's very interesting, and so really, if they're not partnered, they're doing damage to. They're at great risk. Let's just say they're at great risk. They would be better off if they had women taking care of them. Never marry men, but so marriage kind of protects men from themselves. Now, on the other side, though, if you're really thinking about this, you also realize, well, but maybe some of the men who marry are different from the men who don't. So some of those people who are in jail or homeless or whatever, marriage wouldn't protect them. They're not the type to marry, and thinking about them in terms of marriage is just kind of a misconstruction. So marriage is a mixed bag, and I would want to say here, partnership as well. Partnership works, it doesn't work permanently, but it does protect while it's going on. All right, so race, sex, and class affect living arrangements, but why do they affect living arrangements? Am I going to say that the whole story here is race, sex, and class? Certainly not. Actually, now that I've showed you these effects, that should really make you just wonder even more, well, what are the root causes of the problem? So there are a number of major structural changes that the society has gone through over our lifetime that we can associate causally with the changes in living arrangements that I have described. And the first one, I'm sure you've all thought about it, is women's emancipation from motherhood, which began before we were born, with mortality decline. As people learned more about hygiene and medicine improved, women didn't have to have 8 to 10 children to ensure the survival of the race, of the species, if you will. Then there was the invention of birth control, which also actually has been around for a while. But it was the development of the pill that seems to have actually really been the tipping point in terms of changing social and sexual behaviors in this country. Once women had the pill, it was within their own personal locus of control whether they were going to have children or not. And it wasn't too long after that that we saw a lot of changes. And one of the changes that further reinforced these changes, as I'm sure you've already thought of it, is abortion. Abortion also is a way of emancipating women from motherhood. And if abortion is taken away from us, which is in the process of going on now, then you can think about it. That will probably increase the number of marriages. Now, so do you want those marriages to increase? Is that the way we should get women back there barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen by telling them that as soon as they become pregnant, they have no recourse? I personally would hope not. So there's the emancipation from motherhood. The second one, which I'm sure you're also aware of, is women's economic independence. So even though it's the case that women don't earn as much as men, if you have been following the statistics, it is the case now that women are more educated than men are. We need to worry about men. We really do. So actually, as recently as 2010, is what it says here, in 2010, the number of women in the population who held bachelor's degrees outnumbered the number of men. And actually, the number of women who have master's degrees also outnumbers the number of men. In fact, if you haven't heard about it, colleges are now getting really concerned about sex ratios in the schools because the number of applicants that colleges have are women predominate relative to men. Now, the Supreme Court has declared that it is unconstitutional for a college to look at the application of a black person or a Hispanic person and compare that. If that person is less qualified than a white applicant, then that person cannot be admitted. But the Supreme Court has not said anything about what colleges are doing right now, which is essentially to admit less qualified males instead of more qualified females, because they feel that if they don't have balanced sex ratios on their campuses, smart people aren't going to want to go there. So I don't know what you want to think about that, but it is, again, so what we're seeing is a situation where, to some degree, women are being empowered and men are falling behind. And just to round this out, you know this, that women are working. They're not earning as much as men. They're actually only earning about 82 cents for every dollar that men earn. And that ratio has not changed, by the way, for about 20 years. Now, that's, again, an average figure. Most of the women that I know make a lot more than 82 cents on the comparable male. But the average for the country is 82 cents. And that represented about a 10-cent improvement that occurred before around 1990. Since about 1990, 1995, the gender wage gap has not shrunk. Nonetheless, women don't feel that they need to marry a low or an unstable earner. They do feel that their 82 cents is enough, that they are not going to take abuse or stay married to somebody who's a loser because they can stand on their own 2 feet. So I think these things you're familiar with. I don't know that if you thought about it, I've told you anything that you didn't know. But the way the social scientists think about this might be somewhat newer to you, is that at least among the less educated population, there is a shortage of marriageable men. I think that is pretty much what I've kind of been describing to you. That is to say, because of some major changes in our society, the number of males with less than a college degree who are attractive partners has declined. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is the most obvious, is that there's a large drop in well-paying blue-collar jobs. And it's going to get worse with the robots. We'll hear about that on June 4th when we're going to have a speaker who's going to talk about the pros and cons of AI. And one of the cons is certainly unemployment. No question about it. Container ships I have up there, you might wonder, well, what does she mean by that? Well, I have container ships as they are the single most important reason for global trade. You know, you could take a factory that you have in the US and you could move it to another country, you can move it to China or whatever, but that's easy to do. But how do you need innovation to get the products that are now over in China back to the United States? So I'm sure you've seen these enormous container ships they have in Long Beach or whatever. That's a major reason why we don't have manufacturing jobs here, because we can ship stuff around so cheaply and so easily. And then similar changes that have gone hand in hand have been the demise of labor unions, which we're all familiar with. And the failure to raise the minimum wage, that doesn't just affect low-paid men, that affects everybody. But it affects the lower part of the wage structure. We don't have what I would really like to have, which is a maximum wage. There ought to be some limit as to how much money is. I don't think it's. I really think that it's ridiculous what some people can make. There ought to be a law, as it used to be this cartoon about it, right? But nobody's listening to us anymore. No point, but wasting a lot of breath there. One last factor. This is predominantly, but not exclusively, for blacks. The explanation for the shortage of marriageable men, and that's mass incarceration. One of the main reasons that black women are having so much difficulty finding partners is because so many black men have been taken off the streets. And that is a policy decision that could be reversed. But one should also perhaps look at mass incarceration in the context of the decline in blue-collar jobs. Because as people cannot make a decent living in blue-collar jobs, then they have to turn to the alternatives of a drug economy and so forth. So what I've tried to show in this slide is that the number of less educated men who have decent, stable jobs has declined. And this affects less educated women in terms of their finding partners. Now you might think to yourself, if you go back to when we were kids, well, what about the more educated men, right? What about college graduates? Can't these less educated women, if they can't find partners from their own social class, actually it used to be a major mechanism for mobility. Women would marry up, right? Well, sorry, I didn't get all that. Okay, so I'm nearly done. This is like my last. There's been an increase in educational homogamy. Now that is a very big word. You may not know what educational homogamy means. Homogamy means within your own. So educational homogamy means within your own educational group. So in recent decades, male college grads are more likely to marry female college grads, and they're not likely to marry high school grads. That's a huge change that we have seen over our lifetime. Here are some statistics on that. The chances of securing a husband who's a college grad by various levels of women's, and this is a big change. So only 7% of women with a high school diploma have nowadays, among people who are marrying now, have a husband with a college degree. So if you want a husband with a college degree, what do you have to do? You have to get one yourself. And actually this makes complete sense. If you remember back to the other slide, which showed about how much more women are going to college. Well, in the past, I think when I got my college degree, about 17% of women held college degrees, and now what is it? I don't know, 60% or something. So basically, there weren't that many women on campus when I was in college, but now there are more women on campus than there are men. So they're picking their partners there, or at least they're starting to date. They're starting their relationships there, and as they go through life, they're not going to help out these women on the bottom. So finally, norms have changed. And then there's one more. My last slide, I'm sorry, is changing norms, which somebody asked whether that was the reason that for these changes. Now, I will have to tell you that I tend to be, somewhat of a left-winger. That is to say, I tend to think that norms don't change, that what happens is the society changes, and then norms kind of catch up to the society. So I would argue that there has been a decline of the double standard. There's been a change in the norms. Right? But actually that changed, the behavior changed first, and the norms caught up a little bit later. Now there's another expectation, in addition to the fact that norms have changed and women's sexual behavior has changed substantially. There's also a new expectation, which is that mothers work, even if their children are small. And what that means in terms of norms, when I was in high school, there was an expectation that if you got knocked up, you got married. Which is absolutely not the case now. Now there are certainly the changes in sexual norms are part of the reason. But another reason is that nobody imagines that a young woman should stay home with her child anymore. And that we can actually thank President Clinton, who eliminated with great pride at the time what he called welfare as we know it. Which was essentially a system that paid women to stay home and take care of their children. And many of us, and I happen to be one of them, think that small children actually do profit by having someone stay home and take care of them. That doesn't have to be their mother, but it's useful if it's somebody. But that situation is no longer normative. And I can tell you that currently women who have children under 6 are working at the same rate as women who don't have children at all. So that norm that ship has sailed, and that norm is gone. So to conclude, to sum up, since we were young, many more children are raised by a single mom. And many more prime-age adult men are living alone. The women are not living alone because they're living with the kids. I think the disadvantages, there are advantages. I think there are more disadvantages than advantages, although it is probably true that if you are a college graduate like Bella, and or she has a PhD from Harvard, maybe marriages, you can have a very happy single life. But most of us don't have PhDs from Harvard. And these arrangements I'm trying to show are most common really among those who have the fewest resources to deal with it. And alongside of it, we are also seeing, I would associate some of these events with the opioid epidemic, with white supremacy, nationalism and so forth, voting for Trump, that essentially we have a segment of the population that is not doing well, and on a lot of barometers, and we don't seem to have any policies that would be moving along to try to rectify this. So rather than talk about policies myself, I would be happy to hear your opinions. Should something be done? Maybe it's fine. The critics of Melissa Carney's work certainly are less likely to think something should be done. Another question is, even if you wanted to do something, would it work? Could it work? And I thank you for your patience.